Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, where sometimes the only way to find the truth is to crack it open like a safe. In the Old West, some towns built their foundations on rock and hope. Others built them on secrets and lies, burying the skeletons so deep they thought no one would ever find them. Tonight's story is about an outlaw who knew exactly where to dig, a man who planned one last, spectacular heist, not just for gold, but for the most dangerous treasure of all, the truth. This is the story of Cole Maddox and his final, desperate gambit, a tale we call the Redemption Heist. Cole the Shadow Maddox was a man made of dust and twilight. His life had been a long, ghost-like drift through the back alleys and moonless trails of the American West. He was a master thief, a legend whispered in hushed tones by nervous bank tellers and frustrated Pinkerton agents. He was not a brute who smashed his way to a score. He was an artist, a phantom who could slip through a locked door like a wisp of smoke, leaving behind nothing but an empty vault and a lingering sense of impossible violation. His moniker, the Shadow, was well-earned. He was a man who had made a career out of being unseen, unheard, and unknown. But the years of living in the shadows had taken their toll. The lean, weary frame was beginning to ache on cold mornings, and the sharp, intelligent eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a weariness that no amount of sleep could erase. He was tired. Tired of the running, tired of the loneliness, tired of the constant, low-grade fear that was the tax on a life lived outside the law. He had decided, with the quiet finality of a man who has made his peace with his own legend, that it was time for one last job. One final heist that would allow him to disappear for good, to buy a small piece of land somewhere the law had forgotten, and to finally watch a sunset without looking over his shoulder. His target was not a bank in a bustling city or a heavily guarded Union Pacific payroll. It was a place that, on the surface, seemed an absurdly simple mark for a man of his talents, the small, sleepy, and deceptively peaceful town of Havenwood. Havenwood was a picture of prairie respectability. It was a town of whitewashed churches, neat picket fences, and a quiet, almost pious sense of order. It was ruled by a triumvirate of powerful, respected men: Mayor Josiah Kane, a man with a politician's silver tongue and a fatherly demeanor; Sheriff Brody, a stern and yielding lawman who kept the town's peace with an iron fist; and Judge Miller, whose pronouncements from the bench were seen as the final word of both the law and of God. The town was prosperous, peaceful, and, to the outside world, a model of Western civilization. But Cole Maddox knew the truth. He knew that the town's prosperity was a lie, its peace a carefully constructed facade. He knew that the foundation of Havenwood was not built on rock and hope, but on a single, terrible crime, a secret that had been buried for 20 years. A secret that Cole had a very personal reason to unearth. 20 years ago, Havenwood had been a different place, a rough and tumble mining camp populated by a dozen independent prospectors who had struck a rich vein of silver. They had formed a cooperative, a brotherhood of equals, and had built the town together, their shared dream of a prosperous, independent community. One of those men had been Cole's father. Then, the founders Kane, Brody, and Miller had arrived. They had been three ambitious, ruthless men who had seen the wealth of the camp and had decided to take it. What had happened next was a matter of official record: a tragic mine collapse, a fire, a series of accidents that had, in the space of a single bloody year, wiped out all of the original prospectors. All except one, a young boy named Cole, who had escaped the final fire, a silent, terrified witness to the murder of his father and the theft of his entire world. The three men had then used their stolen wealth and their legal cunning to reinvent themselves as the respectable founding fathers of the new, civilized town of Havenwood. They had buried the past, rewritten the history, and had built their kingdom on the graves of the men they had murdered. Cole Maddox was the last living heir to that buried truth. And his final heist was not just about money. It was about a reckoning. He knew that the proof of their crime's original, fraudulent deeds, the ledgers detailing their theft, was kept, along with the town's considerable silver reserves, in a state-of-the-art, fireproof vault in the basement of the new, stone-built town hall. To crack that vault would be to crack open the heart of the town's dark secret, to expose the respectable founders for the murderers and thieves they truly were. He knew he could not do it alone. The town hall was a fortress, guarded day and night by Sheriff Brody's handpicked, brutally efficient deputies. The vault itself was a new, top-of-the-line model from back east, a puzzle of steel and intricate clockwork that would be impossible for one man to defeat in the time he would have. He needed a team. He began to call in the old debts, to assemble the scattered, broken pieces of his own past. He was not looking for common thugs. He needed specialists, ghosts like himself, people who lived on the fringes, who had their own reasons to hate the kind of respectable law that ruled Havenwood. He was assembling a team of the damned to bring down the self-proclaimed saints, and his final ledger had more than just gold on its bottom line. It had justice. Cole Maddox, a man who had spent his life as a solitary predator, now had to become a leader. He knew that the success of the redemption heist depended not just on a flawless plan, but on the quality and the character of the people he chose to execute it. He was not just hiring guns, he was recruiting souls, and he sought out the ghosts of the West, the disenfranchised and the dispossessed who had their own scores to settle with the world. His first recruit was a man who was, in many ways, his mirror image. Silas, known in the wanted posters as the Surgeon, was a gunslinger of legendary skill and a man of few, if any, words. He was a tall, gaunt figure with the cold, steady hands of a watchmaker and eyes as gray and as empty as a dead winter sky. He was not a brawler or a duelist. He was a professional, a man who saw a gunfight not as a matter of honor, but as a complex problem of angles and timing. Cole had ridden with him once, years ago, and had witnessed him take down 3 men in a crossfire without ever seeming to break a sweat. Silas had since retired from the life, living as a recluse in the high mountains, but Cole knew that a man like Silas never truly walks away from the gun. He simply waits for a reason to pick it up again. Cole found him in a remote, one-room cabin, his only companions a collection of books and the whispering of the wind in the pines. "It's a long way to come for a social call, Shadow," Silas said, not even looking up from the book he was reading. "It's not a social call," Cole replied, stepping into the cabin. "It's a job. The last one." He laid out the plan, the maps, the sheer, audacious challenge of it. Silas listened, his expression unchanging. "It's a suicide mission," he said when Cole was finished. "The vault is impossible, and Brody's men are not fools. That's why I need you," Cole said. "I need a man who can make the impossible possible. A man who can hold off a dozen deputies for exactly 7 minutes while I work." Silas closed his book. "What's the score?" "Enough to disappear," Cole said. "But that's not the real prize." He then told Silas the true story of Havenwood, of the murder and the theft that lay at its heart. He was not appealing to Silas's conscience. He knew the man had little of that. He was appealing to his professionalism, to his disdain for the clumsy, brutish evil of men like Kane and Brody. A long silence filled the cabin. "It is an elegant problem," Silas said finally, a flicker of something that might have been professional interest in his dead gray eyes. "All right, Shadow. I'm in. It's been too long since I've worked with a true artist." His second recruit was the wild card, the key to the entire operation. Her name was Isabella, but she was known in the gambling halls and theaters of the border towns as the Nightingale. She was a beautiful, quick-witted singer and actress. A woman who could transform herself into a dozen different personas, from a frightened farm girl to a haughty Spanish aristocrat, with a simple change of clothes and a shift in her accent. She was also a master of distraction, a con artist who could charm a man out of his wallet and his secrets with a single, devastating smile. Her reasons for living a life on the fringes were her own, a story of betrayal and heartbreak that she kept hidden behind a wall of dazzling, theatrical artifice. Cole found her performing in a rowdy, smoke-filled theater in a town that was little more than a collection of saloons. He waited for her after her show, in the dim, cluttered backstage area. "That was a beautiful performance," he said, stepping from the shadows. Isabella, who was used to fending off drunken admirers, turned, a sharp retort on her lips. But she stopped when she saw him. She saw not a drunken cowboy, but a man of quiet, intense purpose. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice wary. "I have a role for you," he said, "the most challenging of your career. It's a tragedy, in 3 acts. Deception, chaos, and, if we're lucky, a little bit of justice." He laid out the plan for her, emphasizing her crucial role. She would be the one to get inside Havenwood, to create the diversion, to be the beautiful, glittering lure that would draw the wolves' attention while the shadows went to work. She listened, her sharp, intelligent eyes missing no detail. "It's dangerous," she said. And the men you're talking about, they are not the kind of men who are charmed by a pretty song. No, Cole agreed. They're the kind of men who are blinded by their own arrogance. They will see a beautiful, helpless woman, and they will underestimate you. And that is exactly what we are counting on. He slid a small, heavy pouch of gold onto her dressing table. Your advance. For costumes. Isabella looked at the gold, then back at Cole. She saw in him a fellow performer, a man who, like her, wore a mask to survive. All right, Mr. Shadow, she said, a slow, calculating smile on her lips. I've always wanted to play a role in a grand, historical drama. Let's give the good people of Havenwood a night at the theater they will never forget. His final recruit was the anchor, the foundation of the entire operation. He was an old, grizzled, and cantankerous ex-sergeant of the U.S. Cavalry named Gus. Gus had been drummed out of the army after a disagreement with a corrupt officer, and he now lived a life of bitter, solitary retirement. His only love a collection of finely crafted explosives. He was the best sapper in the territory, a man who could blow a bank vault or a bridge with the skill and precision of a sculptor. Cole needed him not for the main vault, which was too delicate for explosives, but for the curtain call of their performance, a series of strategic, controlled explosions designed to create chaos, block reinforcements, and ensure their escape. He found Gus in a state of self-imposed exile, his small cabin filled with the acrid smell of chemicals and a lifetime of resentment. I'm retired, Maddox, Gus growled, before Cole could even state his purpose. I'm done with other people's wars. This isn't a war, Gus, Cole said. It's a demolition job. A public service, you might say. We're tearing down a monument to a trio of liars and thieves. He explained the target, not just the vault, but the entire corrupt infrastructure of Havenwood. He appealed not to Gus's greed, but to his deep-seated, explosive hatred for corrupt authority figures, the very kind of men who had ruined his military career. Gus listened, a dangerous, almost gleeful glint appearing in his one good eye. To blow up a sheriff's office, a courthouse, and a bank, all in the name of justice, he said, a slow, wicked grin spreading across his face. Son, you should have led with that. Count me in. This is the kind of retirement party I've been dreaming of. And so, the team was assembled. A ghost, a gunslinger, a songbird, and a sapper. A gathering of the forgotten and the disposed, each a master of their own particular brand of chaos. They met in a secluded, abandoned homestead miles from Havenwood and began to plan, to rehearse, to forge themselves into a single, cohesive unit. They were a motley, unpredictable, and incredibly dangerous crew, and they were about to bring a performance to the quiet, respectable town of Havenwood that would end with a standing and bloody ovation. The first act of the redemption heist began not with a bang, but with the rustle of silk and the whisper of a lie. Isabella, the nightingale, arrived in Havenwood on the afternoon stagecoach, a vision of refined, Eastern elegance in a town of homespun wool and dusty leather. She was playing the role of Isabelle Dubois, the wealthy, recently widowed daughter of a New Orleans shipping magnate, a fragile, beautiful creature seeking the clean air and quiet solace of the West to mend her broken heart. Her performance was flawless. She moved with a delicate, almost tragic grace, her eyes, framed by a black lace veil, holding a look of profound, soulful sorrow. She booked the finest suite in the town's only hotel, her luggage consisting of a half-dozen massive trunks that required the assistance of four struggling men to unload. She tipped lavishly, her voice a soft, cultured whisper, and within an hour, her arrival was the only topic of conversation in the entire town. The wolves of Havenwood did not take long to begin circling. The first to pay his respects was Mayor Josiah Kane, his face a mask of fatherly concern, his eyes, however, holding the cold, appraising glint of a man who smells money. He offered his deepest condolences and the full hospitality of the town. "We are a simple people, Madame Dubois," he said, his voice using a false sincerity. "But we have good, honest hearts. If there is anything at all, that our small community can do to ease your suffering, you have only to ask." Isabella played her part to perfection. She was the grieving, vulnerable, and incredibly wealthy widow. She spoke of her late husband's investments, of her unfamiliarity with the world of finance, of her need for a strong, trustworthy advisor to help her manage her considerable fortune. She was dangling a glittering, irresistible bait, and Kane, a man whose entire life was dedicated to the acquisition of other people's wealth, lunged for it. The second wolf to appear was Sheriff Brody. He came under the guise of ensuring her safety, but his true purpose was assessment. He was the enforcer, the man who judged the strength and weakness of any new rival. He saw a soft, fragile woman, a piece of delicate porcelain who would shatter at the first sign of trouble. He, too, was completely fooled. He posted a deputy outside her hotel room door, a gesture that was meant to be one of protection, but which Isabella knew was one of surveillance. She spent the next few days weaving her web. She took her meals in the hotel dining room, always alone, always the picture of tragic elegance. She made a large, very public donation to the church, earning the gratitude and the trust of the town's respectable matrons. She was creating a character, a persona that was above suspicion, a woman of wealth, grace, and unimpeachable character. Her true work, however, was done in the quiet moments, in the subtle glances, and the carefully chosen words. She began to gather the intelligence the team needed. She would engage the deputy outside her door in idle, sorrowful conversation, and in the process, she would learn the patrol schedules, the number of deputies on duty at any given time, the layout of the town hall and the jail. She accidentally dropped her handkerchief in front of the town's telegraph operator, and as the flustered young man returned it, she charmed him with a sad, beautiful smile, learning in the process that the telegraph line was shut down for repairs for 2 hours every night, from midnight until 2 in the morning. Her primary target, however, was Mayor Kane. He became her constant companion, her self-appointed guide and protector. He showed her the town, he introduced her to the right people, and all the while, he was subtly, skillfully, trying to separate her from her fortune. And all the while, she was doing the same to him, extracting the final, crucial details she needed for the heist. She learned that the vault in the town hall was a time-locked mechanism. It was sealed at 6 o'clock every evening and could not be opened, even with the combination, until 6 o'clock the next morning. She learned that on Friday nights, Sheriff Brody and most of his deputies would gather at the saloon for a weekly, high-stakes poker game, leaving only a skeleton crew of 2 men to guard the town hall. The final piece of her performance, the act that would set the stage for the heist itself, was a grand dinner. She announced that, in gratitude for the town's kindness, she would be hosting a lavish party in the hotel ballroom on the coming Friday night. Everyone of importance was invited. It was to be the social event of the year, a night of music, dancing, and fine champagne, all paid for by the grieving, generous widow. It was the perfect diversion. On Friday night, the entire town's attention, and, more importantly, the attention of its corrupt leadership, would be focused on the hotel. They would be distracted by champagne and the dazzling performance of the beautiful nightingale. And while they were looking at the light, the shadows would be going to work. On the Thursday night before the party, Isabella met Cole for a final, secret rendezvous at a prearranged spot, a secluded grove of cottonwoods down by the river. She passed him her final, detailed notes, a complete blueprint of the town's defenses and routines. "The stage is set, Shadow," she said, her voice a low, excited whisper. "The audience is ready. All that's left is for the curtain to rise." Cole looked at her, at the way her eyes sparkled in the moonlight, a mixture of adrenaline and the performer's pride. He saw not a fragile con artist, but a brilliant, courageous woman who was risking everything for their cause. "You're a better actor than I thought, Isabella," he said, a rare note of genuine admiration in his voice. "My dear Cole," she replied, a theatrical, dazzling smile on her lips, "you haven't seen anything yet. The final act is always the best." She slipped back into the town, back to her role as the grieving widow. The trap was set. The nightingale had sung her beautiful, deceptive song, and the wolves of Havenwood, deafened by their own greed and arrogance, were walking willingly, eagerly, into the slaughter. Friday night descended upon Havenwood with a palpable sense of excitement. The entire town seemed to be holding its breath in anticipation of Madame du Bois's grand party. The hotel ballroom was a blaze of light and music, the sound of a string quartet and happy, champagne-fueled laughter spilling out into the quiet, respectable streets. Mayor Kane, Sheriff Brody, and Judge Miller were all there, preening and confident, the honored guests at a party thrown by their newest and wealthiest victim. They were so focused on the nightingale's beautiful song that they failed to notice the storm that was gathering in the darkness outside. At precisely 1 minute past midnight, as the party was in full swing, the first act of the redemption heist's violent second act began. Gus, the old sapper, who had spent the past 2 days secretly planting his charges, initiated the chaos. It was not a single, massive explosion, but a series of 3, perfectly timed, strategic detonations. The first charge went off at the telegraph office, a small but powerful blast that severed the town's only link to the outside world, turning Havenwood into an isolated, helpless island. The second explosion was at the livery stable, a loud, fiery blast designed not to kill, but to create a massive, terrifying diversion, sending dozens of panicked, screaming horses stampeding through the streets. The third, and most important, charge was a small, precise one, placed at the base of the town's new, and much vaunted, fire bell tower. The tower, its supports shattered, crumpled to the ground with a groaning metallic shriek, silencing the town's only alarm system. In the space of 30 seconds, Gus had blinded, deafened, and panicked the entire town. As the terrified citizens and the distracted deputies rushed to deal with the chaos of the stampede and the fires, Cole and Silas made their move. They emerged from the shadows of a back alley, 2 dark, silent figures moving with a calm, predatory purpose toward their target, the now under-guarded town hall. They took out the 2 remaining deputies with a brutal, silent efficiency. Silas, with his surgeon's precision, disabled one with a single, now lethal shot to the shoulder. Cole, with the ghostly speed that had earned him his name, disarmed the other before he could even raise his weapon. They were inside. They made their way to the basement, to the massive, imposing steel door of the time-locked vault. This was Cole's stage. He opened a leather satchel filled with a collection of strange and intricate tools, drills, files, a stethoscope, and delicate, sensitive tumblers of his own design. 7 minutes, he said to Silas, not looking up from his work. That's how long I figure we have before Brody gets his head straight and realizes what's really happening. You'll have your 7 minutes, Silas replied, his voice a low, calm growl. He took up a position at the top of the basement stairs, a Colt in each hand, his back to a solid stone wall. He was a gray and movable statue of death, a guardian at the gates of the underworld. Cole went to work. His hands, which seemed to move with a life of their own, were a blur of motion. He was not a thief, but a surgeon, performing a delicate, life-or-death operation on the vault's intricate, clockwork heart. He used the stethoscope, listening to the faint, almost imperceptible clicks of the tumblers. He used a small, oil-fueled drill to create a tiny, precise opening, through which he inserted a series of long, thin wires. He was not forcing the lock, he was seducing it, tricking the complex mechanism into believing that it was 6 o'clock in the morning. Outside, the 7-minute war began. Sheriff Brody, a competent if corrupt lawman, had indeed figured it out. Realizing the fires were a diversion, he and a half-dozen of his best men were now charging toward the town hall. They were met by Silas. The gunfight in the main hall of the building was a legend in the making. It was not a wild, chaotic shootout. It was a masterclass in tactical, defensive gunnery. Silas used the columns and the heavy oak desks as cover, never staying in one place for more than a few seconds. His Colt spoke in a steady, rhythmic, and devastatingly accurate rhythm. He was not a wild gunman, he was a machine, a perfect, logical engine of violence. He did not waste a single bullet. Every shot was aimed precise and effective. He was not trying to kill all of them, but to hold them, to slow them, to buy his partner the precious seconds he needed. Down in the basement, Cole was oblivious to the war raging above him. He was in a state of pure, absolute concentration, his entire world shrunk to the faint, metallic whispers of the vault's inner workings. He felt the tumblers begin to align. He felt the complex mechanism begin to yield. With a final, satisfying clunk, the massive, time-locked bolts slid back. He had done it. He swung open the heavy steel door. Inside, the neatly stacked silver bars gleamed in the lantern light, but he ignored them. He went straight to a heavy, iron-bound chest at the back of the vault. It was here, he knew, that the town's real treasure, and its darkest secret, was kept. He pried open the chest. Inside, Beneath a layer of mundane legal documents were the items he had come for, the original, fraudulent deeds to the Havenwood mines, signed by Kane, Brody, and Miller. And beneath them, a series of private, leather-bound ledgers, detailing, in Judge Miller's own meticulous hand, 2 decades of bribery, extortion, and murder. He had the proof. He stuffed the ledgers into his satchel and grabbed 2 heavy bags of silver payment for his team. As he turned to leave, he heard the gunfire from above finally cease. His 7 minutes were up. He raced up the stairs to find a scene of carnage. 2 of Brody's deputies lay dead. 3 others were wounded. And Silas was slumped against the far wall, a dark, crimson stain spreading across his chest, but he was still alive, a smoking pistol still clutched in his hand. Sheriff Brody himself was nowhere to be seen. "Time to go," Silas rasped, a grim, bloody smile on his face. Cole helped his wounded partner, and the 2 of them slipped out the back of the town hall, disappearing back into the chaos of the night they had created. Just as Brody and his remaining men finally breached the front, the redemption heist was over. It had been a success, but it had come at a high, bloody price. The chaos in Havenwood raged for the better part of an hour before a semblance of order could be restored. By the time Sheriff Brody and his remaining men finally secured the town hall and the fires had been brought under control, the ghosts were long gone. Cole and the wounded Silas had vanished into the same darkness from which they had emerged, leaving behind a town that was not just physically battered, but psychologically shattered. The immediate aftermath was one of stunned, disbelieving silence. Brody, his face a grim mask of fury and humiliation, stood in the violated sanctuary of his vault. The bags of missing silver were a painful but expected blow. But the true, devastating loss was the empty iron chest and the missing ledgers. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that this had never been a simple robbery. It had been an exhumation. A ghost from a 20-year-old grave had returned, and he had just stolen the evidence that could send them all to the gallows. The first casualty of the heist's aftermath was the beautiful, tragic Madame Du Bois, Isabella. Her role in the Grand Theater now complete, had intended to slip away in the confusion of the fires. But her escape was cut off by Mayor Kane himself. The mayor, his initial, fawning admiration for the wealthy widow now curdled into a cold, reptilian suspicion, confronted her in the hotel hallway as she was making her way to the back stairs. "A remarkable series of coincidences, wouldn't you say, madam?" Kane said, his voice a low, menacing purr. "Fires, explosions, a bank robbery, all on the night of your charming little party." Isabella tried to play her part one last time, her eyes wide with a feigned, damsel in distress terror. "Mayor, I am frightened half to death. What is happening?" But Kane was no longer blinded by her performance. He had seen the way she had remained naturally calm during the initial chaos, her eyes not on the fires, but on the town hall. He grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh like a steel trap. "The performance is over," he snarled. "Who are you? Who are you working with?" Her beautiful, deceptive mask finally fell away, replaced by a look of cold, defiant contempt. "You wouldn't know him," she said, her voice dripping with scorn. "He's not your kind. He's a man who pays his debts." The confession, and the insult, sealed her fate. Kane, his face contorted with a silent, apoplectic rage, dragged her not to the sheriff's office, but to a dark, soundproofed room in the hotel's basement. The nightingale had sung her final, beautiful, and treacherous song. Now, she was a caged bird, and she knew that Kane was not a man who left witnesses alive. The second casualty was Gus, the old sapper. His job had been to create the diversion, and then disappear. But as he was making his escape, he saw a group of Brody's men cornering a family of innocent homesteaders, who had been drawn into the street by the chaos. The deputies, spooked and enraged, were about to take out their frustrations on the terrified family. Gus, a man who had spent his life railing against the abuse of authority, found that he could not just walk away. In a final, defiant act of his own personal code, he created one last diversion, drawing the deputies' fire upon himself, allowing the family to escape. He was gunned down in a hail of bullets, a bitter, forgotten soldier who had died not for a flag or for a cause, but for a simple, instinctive act of decency. Meanwhile, miles from the town, Cole was tending to Silas in their secluded hideout. The gunslinger's wound was serious, a deep, ragged tear in his chest that was bleeding profusely. Cole, using the rough field medicine he had learned over a lifetime on the run, managed to stop the bleeding and bandage the wound, but he knew that Silas needed a real doctor, and soon. "You should have left me," Silas rasped, his voice weak, a bloody foam on his lips. "The ledgers. They were more important. The job is not over until the whole team is paid," Cole replied, his voice a low growl. "And you, my friend, are a very expensive hire." But as the sun rose, a new, grim reality set in. Cole knew that with the theft of the ledgers, this was no longer a simple matter of a robbery. This was now a war for survival. Kane and Brody would not just be hunting a thief. They would be hunting to exterminate the truth. They would use every resource, every man, every ounce of their corrupt power to find those ledgers and to bury anyone who had seen them. His first priority was to get the ledgers to a safe place. He knew he could not do it himself. He had to stay with Silas. He had one last, desperate card to play. He took out a small, coded message he had prepared and gave it, along with a gold coin, to a young, trusted stable boy from a nearby town, with instructions to ride like the wind to the territorial capital and deliver it to a specific, unassuming lawyer, a man who owed Cole a life debt from long ago. The message was a summons, a signal that the evidence was secured and that the legal part of the war was about to begin. But he knew that would take days, perhaps weeks. In the meantime, he and Silas were trapped, hunted, and running out of time. Their audacious, brilliant heist had been a success, but they had paid a terrible price. Gus was dead. Isabella was captured. Silas was dying. And Cole, the master planner, the man who was always 2 steps ahead, found himself in a position he had never been in before, on the defensive, with the lives of his remaining partners in his hands, and the full, vengeful weight of a corrupt and desperate town about to come crashing down upon him. The truth had been unearthed, but the price of bringing it to the light was proving to be higher than even he had ever imagined. The hunt for Cole Maddox and the stolen ledgers began with a cold, systematic fury. Sheriff Brody, his authority now absolute, and his actions fueled by a desperate, cornered animal rage, locked down the entire region. He deputized every able-bodied man with a gun and a grudge, turning the peaceful countryside around Havenwood into a massive, armed dragnet. Roadblocks were set up on every trail, and patrols of heavily armed men swept through the hills, their orders simple and brutal: shoot on sight. Cole knew their secluded hideout would not remain safe for long. Silas was growing weaker, a fever setting in from his wound, and they could not stay put. They needed a place to fortify, a place where they could make a stand. Cole's mind, always working, always analyzing the terrain, settled on a place from his own childhood, a place that was both a sanctuary and a ghost-filled tomb, the ruins of the old, original mining camp where his father had been murdered. The camp was located in a narrow, easily defensible box canyon, a place the newer residents of Havenwood didn't even know existed. It was a place of ghosts and painful memories, but it was also a fortress. The journey to the canyon was a grueling, desperate ordeal. Cole had to half-carry the feverish, delirious Silas, all while evading Brody's patrols. They moved by night, hiding during the day, their progress agonizingly slow. They finally stumbled into the canyon, a place overgrown with 2 decades of weeds and sorrow, and collapsed, exhausted and on the brink of collapse. Cole knew they had only bought themselves a little time. Sooner or later, Brody's trackers would find them. He began to prepare the canyon for a siege, his mind a cold, logical machine. He used the old, rotten timbers from the collapsed mine entrance to create barricades. He found a few of the old prospectors' forgotten tools and used them to set crude but effective deadfall traps on the narrow trail that was the canyon's only entrance. His most important discovery was in the ruins of his father's old cabin. Buried beneath a loose floorboard, he found his father's old, heavy, long-barreled buffalo rifle, a .50 caliber Sharps, and a half-full box of its massive, lead cartridges, all still preserved in a wrapping of oilcloth. The gun was a relic, a thing of immense power and precision, a sniper's weapon. It was a message from his father's ghost. For 3 days, a tense, quiet peace settled over the canyon. Cole tended to Silas, whose fever raged, and he watched the entrance to the canyon, the big Sharps rifle a heavy, comforting weight in his hands. On the 4th day, they came. A patrol of a dozen of Brody's best men, led by the sheriff himself, appeared at the mouth of the canyon. They had found his trail. The battle for the canyon was not a wild, chaotic gunfight. It was a slow, methodical, and terrifying siege. Brody's men were professionals, and they did not charge blindly into the canyon. They took up positions, using the rocks and trees as cover, and began to lay down a steady, suppressing fire. But they were facing a master of defensive warfare. Cole did not waste his precious ammunition. He used the Big Sharps rifle with a chilling, surgical precision. He would wait, sometimes for a half an hour, until one of Brody's men grew careless, exposing himself for a split second. And then the big rifle would roar its deep, booming report echoing through the canyon, and a man would fall. He was not just a gunman, he was a ghost, a phantom who seemed to be everywhere at once. He would fire from a crevice in the rocks, then disappear, only to fire again minutes later from a different position, 100 yards away. He was using the canyon's natural acoustics and his intimate knowledge of its terrain to create the illusion that they were facing not one man, but a dozen. The siege lasted for 2 days. The psychological toll on Brody's men was immense. They were being hunted, picked off one by an enemy they could not see, their numbers slowly, inexorably dwindling. Their morale began to crumble under the relentless, nerve-shredding pressure. Inside the canyon, Silas, his fever finally breaking, awoke to the sound of the battle. He was weak, but his mind was clear. He saw what Cole was doing, the impossible, one-man stand he was making. He crawled to the barricade, a pistol in his shaking hand. "You should have left me, you sentimental fool," he rasped, a grim smile on his face. "I told you," Cole replied, never taking his eyes off the canyon entrance. "The whole team gets paid." The addition of Silas's second gun, as weak as he was, made a difference. The two ghosts, the thief and the gunslinger, were now fighting back to back, a two-man army holding off a superior force. By the end of the second day, Brody's posse was shattered. They had lost half their men, their nerve was broken, and they refused to go any further into the canyon of death. Brody, his face a mask of black, impotent rage, had no choice but to fall back, to retreat to Havenwood to regroup. Cole and Silas had won. They had survived the siege, but they knew it was a temporary victory. Brody would be back, and he would come with a bigger army, with dynamite, with a force that even they could not hope to hold off. As darkness fell over the silent, corpse-strewn canyon, Cole knew that their time was running out. He had the ledgers, the proof. But it was useless if he was dead. He had to get it out. He had to trust that his message had reached the capital, that help was on the way. But help was a long way off, and Brody's revenge would be swift and total. The siege of the Shadow was over, but the final, desperate battle for the truth was still to come. The retreat of Sheriff Brody's posse from the canyon was not a victory for Cole, it was merely a reprieve. He knew Brody's rage and desperation would only fester and grow. He would return, and he would come with a force that two wounded men could not possibly repel. Time had become their greatest enemy. Back in Havenwood, the town was a prison of fear and suspicion. Brody, his public authority shattered by his failure at the canyon, resorted to the only tool he had left, brute force. He and Mayor Kane declared a state of emergency, their thugs now an occupying army that ruled the streets with open intimidation. Their primary goal was to find the leak, the traitor who was feeding information to their phantom enemy. Their suspicion fell upon the one person whose captivity was now a dangerous liability, Isabella. The Nightingale, who had been held in a dark, wine-cellar prison beneath the hotel, was dragged before them. She was bruised and weakened, but her spirit was unbroken. Kane and Brody tried to interrogate her, to beat the location of Cole's hideout from her. But she was a performer, and her greatest role was that of a woman who knew nothing, her terror a perfect, impenetrable mask. Kane, a man who saw everyone as a transactional commodity, finally made his final, desperate offer. It was not a threat, but a bargain, a deal with the devil. "Your loyalty to this thief is admirable, my dear," he said, his voice a silky, poisonous whisper. "But he has abandoned you. He is a ghost, and soon, he will be a corpse. I, on the other hand, am offering you a future." He laid out his proposition. He would arrange for her to be rescued, to be hailed as a victim who had bravely escaped her captors. He would give her a small fortune, enough to start a new life, to become the respectable actress she had always pretended to be. In exchange, all she had to do was help them set a trap. She would lead them to Cole. Think of it, Kane purred. A new life. Wealth. Respectability. All that, in exchange for a man who is already dead. A man who left you here to rot. It was a powerful temptation. Isabella was a survivor, a pragmatist who had spent her life making the choices that would ensure she lived to see another day. To refuse was to sentence herself to a slow, certain death in this dark, damp cellar. To accept was to betray the only man who had ever treated her as an equal, as a partner. Meanwhile, up in the canyon, Cole and Silas were making their own desperate plans. Silas, though still weak, was recovering, his iron will stronger than his wounds. He knew their situation was untenable. We can't stay here, Silas rasped, his voice still weak. He'll come back with dynamite. He'll seal this canyon and make it our tomb. We can't run, Cole countered. Brody will have every trail watched. And I won't abandon the ledgers. They're the only thing that makes any of this mean anything. It was then that Silas, the cold-blooded professional, the man who saw every situation as a problem of angles and odds, proposed the final, unthinkable gambit. Then there's only one move left, he said, his dead gray eyes fixed on Cole. You have to give them what they want. You have to give them a target they cannot resist. What are you talking about? Cole asked. You, Silas said, his voice flat. You are the ghost they are hunting. They are not afraid of me, or the girl, or the old man. They are afraid of you. You are the only one who can bring the whole house of cards down. So, you must let them catch you. The idea was insane. That's suicide, Cole said. No, Silas corrected him. It's a trade. It's the final act of the play. You will surrender. You will offer them the one thing they want more than the ledgers your head. In exchange, they must agree to a public trial, right here, in Havenwood, in front of the whole town. Cole began to see the cold, brilliant, and utterly insane logic of the plan. A public trial, a stage, a final performance where the truth, the whole, sordid story of Havenwood, could finally be told. The ledgers themselves were just paper. The real weapon was the story they contained, and that story needed an audience. They'll never agree, Cole said. They'll just kill me. They will agree, Silas insisted, because their real enemy isn't you. It's the U.S. Marshals. Your message got to the Capitol. The lawyer is making noise. Kane and Brody know that a federal investigation is coming. A public trial, where they bravely bring the notorious outlaw Cole the Shadow Maddox to justice, is their only chance to control the narrative, to make themselves look like heroes before the real law arrives. They will take the bait. It's the only move they have left to save their own skins. The plan was a razor's edge. It depended on the arrogance of their enemies, on the courage of a woman trapped in a cellar, and on the hope that the truth, once spoken aloud, would be a more powerful force than a dozen guns. Cole made his decision. He penned a note. It was a letter of surrender, addressed to Sheriff Brody. He laid out his terms. He would turn himself in unarmed, in exchange for the guaranteed safety of his partners and a fair, public trial to be held in the Havenwood town square. He gave the note to a local trapper who had been secretly supplying them with food, with instructions to deliver it to Brody. The final act had been written. Cole the Shadow Maddox, the man who had spent his life evading the law, was about to deliver himself into its corrupt, waiting hands. It was a desperate, final gambit. I bet that the power of a story, and the conscience of a broken town, would be enough to save them all. He was trading his own life for one last chance at the truth. The news of Cole Maddox's surrender fell upon Havenwood like a thunderclap. For Brody and Kane, it was a stunning, almost unbelievable victory, delivered to them at the very moment they had believed all was lost. Their phantom enemy, the ghost who had haunted them, had simply given up. Their initial reaction was one of triumphant, savage glee, but as they read Cole's terms, they understood the true nature of his gambit. A public trial. It was a brilliant, dangerous move. As Silas had predicted, they knew they could not refuse. The territorial capital was buzzing with rumors. The lawyer Cole had contacted was filing writs and demanding investigations. A quiet, back-alley execution was no longer an option. They needed to be seen as the heroes, the brave lawmen who had brought the notorious Shadow to justice. A public trial was a stage, and they were confident that they could control the performance. They agreed to his terms. The trial of Cole Maddox was scheduled for 2 days later, a grand, public spectacle to be held in the town square. A gallows was constructed, a new, hungry-looking structure of raw pine, a clear and brutal statement of the trial's foregone conclusion. For Isabella, the news was a double-edged sword. Cain, in a show of good faith, had her released from the cellar. She was no longer a prisoner, but she was still a captive, watched day and night by Brody's men. She understood Cole's desperate plan. He had sacrificed himself to create a stage, and he was counting on her to be the star performer. The pressure of it, the weight of his life now resting on her shoulders, was immense. The night before the trial, a miracle occurred. Silas, who had been presumed dead or to have fled, appeared at the edge of town. He was a ghost, pale and gaunt, but he was alive. He made contact with Isabella, his message simple: "The final act is yours. But you will not be alone. Watch for the signal." The day of the trial was a hot, breathless affair. The entire town of Havenwood, and people from miles around, had gathered in the town square. It was a grim, carnival-like atmosphere. Sheriff Brody was the prosecutor, Judge Miller was the judge, and a jury of 12 of Cain's most loyal and most indebted cronies sat in a solemn, preordained row. Cole was led to a small, wooden defendant's box, his hands in chains. He looked pale and tired, but his stormy eyes were clear and calm. He scanned the crowd, his gaze finally resting on Isabella. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "The stage is yours." The trial was a farce. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, painting Cole as the ruthless leader of a gang of terrorists who had waged war on their peaceful community. Witnesses, their testimonies bought or coerced, told wild tales of his brutality. When it was time for the defense, Cole's court-appointed lawyer, a terrified, alcoholic old man, simply stood and stammered that his client had no statement to make. "Does the defendant have anything to say for himself before this court passes sentence?" Judge Miller asked, his voice booming with a false gravity. "I do," a clear, strong voice said. But it was not Cole's. A pathway opened in the crowd, and Isabella walked forward. She was no longer the frightened, bruised prisoner. She was dressed in a simple but elegant black dress, her head held high, her face a mask of cold, righteous anger. She was the nightingale, and she was about to give the performance of her life. "I am a witness," she declared, her voice ringing with a theatrical clarity that captivated the entire square. "But not for the prosecution. I am a witness for the truth." Before Brody or Cain could react, she began to speak. She told her story. She told of Cole's plan, not as an act of terror, but as a quest for justice. And then she produced her evidence. It was not the ledgers. They were too dangerous to bring here. It was a single, sworn affidavit, a document she had secretly drafted and had signed by Gus before his death, and had then smuggled out with the stable boy who had carried Cole's message. It was Gus's final testament, detailing his own story of corruption at the hands of the army, and his reasons for joining Cole's demolition of Havenwood's corrupt founders. And then she produced the ledgers, or rather, copies of them. She had spent her captivity not just enduring, but working, painstakingly recreating the key pages of the ledgers from memory, her actress's mind a powerful tool of recall. The copies were not legal proof, but they were a narrative, a story of 20 years of murder and greed. "The real criminals are not in that box," she cried, her voice soaring, pointing a trembling, accusing finger at the 3 men who had built their lives on a lie. "They are on that bench, and in that mayor's office, and behind that sheriff's star. The men who stole this town. The men who murdered Cole Maddox, his father." The crowd, which had been a passive, fearful audience, began to murmur, to stir. The story she told, the details she provided, resonated with their own long-suppressed fears and suspicions. Cain, his face a mask of purple rage, finally reacted. "Lies," he screamed. "She's a whore and a liar. Seize her." 2 of Brody's deputies moved toward her. But before they could reach her, the signal came. A single, high-powered rifle shot roared from the roof of the hotel. It was not aimed at a person. It was aimed at the rope of the hangman's gallows. The thick rope, severed by the bullet, fell to the stage with a pathetic, snake-like hiss. "Silas!" At the same instant, A second sound, a series of muffled explosions, came from the direction of the bank, the courthouse, and the sheriff's office. Small, precise charges, just as Gus had planned, designed not to destroy, but to create a cloud of thick, choking smoke and chaos. The town square was thrown into a state of absolute pandemonium. The crowd surged. The jury fled. Brody's deputies, their attention divided, were momentarily paralyzed. And in that single, perfect moment of chaos, the final act of the heist was executed. A small, elite group of men, appearing as if from nowhere, moved with a brutal, professional efficiency. They were not outlaws. They were U.S. Marshals. The lawyer in the capital had succeeded. The federal government had finally arrived in Havenwood. They ignored the chaos. Their only target, the three stunned, disbelieving founders. Mayor Kane, Sheriff Brody, and Judge Miller were seized, disarmed, and placed in chains before they could even comprehend what was happening. Cole, in his defendant's box, was freed by a marshal who simply snapped his chains and handed him a pistol. "Good work, Maddox," the marshal said with a grim smile. "You just saved us a lot of paperwork." The redemption heist was finally, truly, over. The truth, in a final, explosive performance, had been set free. The hangman's stage had become the stage for a new, and just, beginning for the town of Havenwood. The chaos in the town square was not the wild and indiscriminate violence of an outlaw raid. It was the swift, decisive, and overwhelming application of federal law. The U.S. Marshals, led by a grizzled, no-nonsense veteran named Marshal Thompson, had used the chaos created by Silas and the specter of Cole's trial to perfection. They had severed the head of the serpent with a single, clean strike. As the smoke cleared and the stunned townspeople began to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened, a new and legitimate order began to assert itself. Kane, Brody, and Miller, the untouchable titans who had ruled Havenwood for 2 decades, were now just 3 pale, trembling men in chains. Their reign of terror brought to an abrupt and ignominious end. The trial that followed was not the theatrical farce that had been staged in the square, but a thorough, methodical, and damning federal hearing. The star witnesses were Isabella and Cole. Isabella, with her actress's poise and her eidetic memory, recounted the story of the conspiracy with a chilling, captivating clarity. And Cole, the man who had been in the defendant's box just a week before, now stood as the prosecution's key witness. He did not speak with the fire of a vengeful son. He spoke with the quiet, cold precision of a master thief, laying out the intricate details of the founder's criminal enterprise. And then, he presented the final, irrefutable proof, the original ledgers, which he had arranged for his lawyer to deliver directly into the hands of Marshal Thompson. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The 3 founders of Havenwood were found guilty of a litany of crimes, from murder and conspiracy to treason. Their sentences were swift and final, death by hanging, on the very gallows they had constructed for Cole. The sins of the past had finally been brought into the light, and the price was being paid in full. In the days that followed, a strange, quiet, and hopeful atmosphere settled over Havenwood. The town was in a state of shock, but it was the shock of a patient who has just had a malignant tumor removed. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a generation, it was a future that they themselves would get to write. Cole Maddox and his surviving partners became reluctant, celebrated heroes. But they were ghosts, and they were not meant for the bright, hopeful light of the new Havenwood. Their work was done, and the time had come for them to disappear back into the shadows from which they had come. Isabella was the first to leave. She had been offered a starring role in a new, grand theater in San Francisco, a legitimate career that her fame from the trial had made possible. She came to say goodbye to Cole at the small, secluded cabin where he and Silas had been staying. "So, the Nightingale is flying west," Cole said, a rare, small smile on his face. "A girl has to make a living," she replied, her own smile a mixture of triumph and a genuine, gentle sadness. "And you, Shadow? What will you do now? Your war is over." "My war has been over for a long time," he said, his gaze distant. "I've just been paying off the interest." He held out a heavy bag of silver, her full share of the heist. "For your next costume." She took the bag, but then she did something unexpected. She reached up and kissed him, a brief, gentle touch on his cheek. "Thank you, Cole," she whispered. for giving me a role worth playing." She then turned and walked away, a bright, dazzling figure of hope, leaving the shadows behind her. Silas was the next to depart. His wound had healed, leaving another scar on a body already mapped with them. He was a man of few words, and his farewell was as efficient and as unsentimental as he was. "The debt is paid," he said to Cole, as he saddled his horse. He was referring not to the money, but to the instated code of professionalism that existed between them. "The debt is paid," Cole agreed. He held out Silas's share of the silver. Silas simply shook his head. "I have what I came for," he said, tapping the side of his head. "An elegant problem, elegantly solved. That is payment enough." He swung into his saddle, the gaunt, gray ghost ready to return to his mountain solitude. He looked down at Cole, and for the first time, a flicker of something that might have been friendship appeared in his dead gray eyes. "Stay out of vaults, Shadow," he said. "It's a young man's game." He then turned and rode away, disappearing back into the high, lonely country, a legend returning to his myth. Now, only Cole was left. The architect of the redemption heist stood alone, the ghosts of his past finally, truly, laid to rest. He had done it. He had avenged his father. He had brought justice to the town that had been built on his family's grave. The ledger was balanced. But the question remained, what does a shadow do when the sun finally comes out? The execution of Josiah Kane, Sheriff Brody, and Judge Miller was a somber, quiet affair. The town of Havenwood did not celebrate. They watched in a silent, collective act of witness, a final, necessary closing of a long and painful chapter in their history. As the trapdoors fell, a palpable sense of release, of a great and terrible weight being lifted, settled over the town. Cole Maddox watched from a distant hillside, a solitary and seen observer. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel satisfaction. He felt only a profound, soul-deep quiet. The fire of vengeance that had driven him for 20 years had finally burned itself out, leaving only a cold, empty stillness. The Shadow's last job was done. He was a free man. He had a small fortune in silver, and a future that was, for the first time in his life, a completely blank page. He could go anywhere, be anyone. He could finally buy that small piece of land he had dreamed of, and watch the sunset without looking over his shoulder. But as he sat on that hillside, looking down at the town that was his birthright, he knew that it was not that simple. He was not the young, innocent boy who had fled the fire. He was Cole the Shadow Maddox, an outlaw, a thief, a man who had lived his life in the darkness. Could a shadow ever truly learn to live in the sun? He rode away from Havenwood without saying goodbye to anyone. He drifted for a time, from one town to the next, a man with no purpose, no destination. He was a ghost, haunting the edges of a world he was no longer a part of. The open ending of Cole Maddox's story is not a question of where he went, but of who he became. There are, as with all such legends, conflicting stories. Some say he did buy that ranch in a quiet, forgotten corner of Oregon, and lived out the rest of his days in a peaceful, anonymous solitude. A quiet man with a haunted past who was known for his strange, intricate knowledge of locks and his deep, abiding distrust of bankers and politicians. Others tell a different story. They say that he could not escape the man he had become. They say that the skills of the shadow were too ingrained, the thrill of the heist too addictive. They whisper of a series of brilliant, impossible robberies that took place over the next few years, targeting only the most corrupt and powerful of the new railroad and cattle barons. They say it was the work of a ghost, a master thief who stole not just for money, but for a different kind of justice, a man who would leave a portion of his score to the poor and the dispossessed. A Robin Hood of the plains. But the story that is most often told, the one that feels the most true, is a quieter and more poignant one. It comes from a U.S. Marshal, the same Marshal Thompson who had arrested the founders of Havenwood. Years later, he was tracking a particularly vicious gang of outlaws. The trail led him to a small, struggling community of homesteaders who were being terrorized by the gang. When the marshal arrived, he found a strange scene. The gang was gone, having been run out of town. But they had not been driven out by a posse or a gunfight. They had been dismantled, ruined, from the inside out. Their supplies had been mysteriously spoiled, their horses had been spooked and scattered, and a series of forged letters had turned the gang members against each other in a paranoid, bloody feud. It was the work of a master strategist, a ghost who had fought a war without firing a single shot. The grateful townspeople told the marshal they had been helped by a quiet, solitary stranger who had drifted into town, a man with sad, stormy eyes. He had stayed for a few weeks, helping them organize, teaching them how to defend themselves, how to be strong together. And then, once the threat was gone, he had disappeared, as quietly as he had arrived, accepting no payment, leaving behind only his thanks. The marshal knew, in his heart, who the stranger had been. He knew that Cole Maddox had found his final, truest calling. He was not a rancher, and he was not a thief. He was a guardian, a silent, anonymous protector of the weak and the vulnerable, a shadow who moved through the darkest corners of the West, not to steal, but to serve. The outlaw's final heist had not been for gold or for vengeance. It had been for his own soul. And in the end, it seemed, he had finally, truly, stolen it back. His final disappearance was not an escape into the darkness, but a quiet, deliberate step into a new and different kind of light.